She vanished into the wild to keep his secret safe, and he tore the kingdom apart to find her. I found her fire first. Cold ash, a ring of stones she'd set herself, the pine bough shelter half finished at the base of the ridge as if she'd stopped in the middle of building it and simply walked north into the dark. The snow around the hearth had been swept clean on one side, deliberately, not by wind, and in the center of the ash a single thing remained, a shard of dark glass, the broken face of a long glass lens. She had left it for me. I didn't understand that until later, until I understood what she had seen through it. My wolf understood before I did. He had been pulling me north for 2 days, low in my chest, restless in a way I did not recognize, not the usual hunger or the call to the border, but something older, something wordless. I had not slept. My second Bryn had ridden at my left and said nothing, because he knew that when my wolf set his direction, argument was a waste of breath. I am Calder, Alpha King of Voronmal. I have ruled this Iron Winter Kingdom for 14 years. I have held the northern border through 3 succession wars, 2 famines, and a winter that lasted 19 months and took 40 souls from the outer settlements. My council calls me controlled, steady, implacable, the king who does not panic, who does not search for what he has not lost. I tore my kingdom apart looking for her. Her name was Saren, and I need to tell you how I did not see her, not really, not as she deserved, until she was gone. She had held the northern watchtower post for 4 years. The tower sat on the Voronmal border ridge, 8 hours' hard ride from the capital, and it was the sort of posting that the pack's ambitious young warriors cycled through in their first winter and asked not to repeat. The ridge was cold even in the brief, warm season, and in deep winter the wind off the Greenwood Plateau came with an edge like drawn iron. The tower itself was old stone, older than my grandfather's time, with a single interior hearth, and a long glass mounted in the north-facing window for watching the approach roads. Most sentinels spent their rotation counting days. Saren spent hers watching. That was what I knew of her, and I am ashamed now at how little I'd made of it. My pack administrator, a lean, efficient man named Osric, had mentioned her in quarterly reports. The Grenhol Post, the border watcher, the woman with the long glass, Saren of the outer settlements. Good at her post, sends accurate reports, asks for nothing. That was the sum of her in the official record. A woman who asked for nothing. In a pack that rewarded those who asked loudly, that was nearly the same as being invisible. I had seen her twice. Once at the autumn muster, 3 years past, when she'd stood in the line of border sentinels, and I'd walked the row and she had met my eyes, briefly, steady, without flinching and without performing, and I had passed on. Once at the winter provisioning, when she had waited at the end of the queue after every other sentinel had taken their allotment, and I had noticed the waiting and not wondered why. She was not unremarkable. I simply did not look long enough to see that. My wolf, apparently, had been paying attention all along. The treachery began, as treacheries usually do, not in some dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet conversation that the wrong person overheard. Lord Cassaveth held the eastern reaches of Voronmal, 3 days' ride from the capital. He was wealthy, patient, and careful in the way that patient men who want what they do not have are careful. I had known for some years that his ambitions exceeded his territory, but he was precise enough to give me nothing solid to move against, and my counsel had counseled patience. He will overreach eventually. Let him. They were right that he would overreach. They were wrong that we would be prepared for it. What Cassaveth had arranged, and this I learned only from Saren, only after I found her, only after everything, was an agreement with 2 outer border clans, the Heldrath and the Voss, to allow passage through the northern ridge in exchange for land grants he had no authority to give. He had promised them Voronmal's northern quarter. He had set a date. He had moved 3 dozen of his own men into positions along the border road in the weeks before, a few at a time, dressed as traders. Saren saw them through her long glass. She was not supposed to be watching that particular approach road on that particular evening. She had been watching the storm front building off the Greenwood and had shifted the long glass south to gauge where it would break. And there they were, 8 men in the hollow below the second ridgeline, not traders, not by the way they moved or what they carried, and with them a rider she recognized from his visits to the capital. A man from Cassaveth's personal household. She watched for 3 hours. She counted. She saw the signal fire they lit when the main Heldrath column came over the far ridge. Then she heard voices on the stairs. 2 of Cassaveth's men had already reached the tower. I learned all of this later in fragments as she told it to me, sitting across the storm shelter fire with frost still in her hair, and that steady gaze fixed somewhere past my shoulder the way it went when she was ordering events in her mind, setting them in sequence. But I am telling you the story as it should be told, not as I received it in pieces, and so I am telling you what she did. She did not hide, she did not fight, though she could have, she was not unarmed, and she was faster than she looked. She had 4 seconds, she told me later, and she used them this way. She took the long glass from the mount. She stripped the lens from the front element. She dropped the glass through the northern shutter into the snow 30 feet below where it would be buried and not found. She tucked the lens in her boot. And she went down the stairs with her hands visible and told the 2 men she had been checking the storm readings and invited them to see the log if they liked, which they did not. And they told her there was a situation developing on the border road and she should stay in the tower until it was resolved. She agreed. She waited until they went back down. Then she went out the southern window with a rope. She knew that if she rode for the capital, the obvious route, the fastest route, Casavith's men on the border road would intercept her before she reached the valley. She knew that a message bird from the tower would be assumed compromised or simply not sent. There had been 2 birds already missing from the loft, which she had noted in her log and no one had acted on. She knew that if she were caught, the lens she carried, the only evidence of what she had seen, the only thing with Casavith's man's face recorded on its glass, the only thing that could be verified would be taken. So she went north, into the Greenwold, into the storm, into the kind of cold that kills in a night if you stop moving. She went north because the Greenwold Trail looped back south 40 miles on, through the far ridge, and came out 2 days' ride from the capital on the western road, the road that Casavith's men did not patrol, because it was the hard road, the one no one chose in winter. She went north because the long way in this case was the only way, and she went because there was no one else. Every other sentinel at the border post was inside Casavith's arrangement or too far away or too easily turned. She had 4 years of standing alone at the end of a queue, and she knew in the clean, efficient way that she knew things, that she was the only one who was going to do this. I think about that even now, the cold, the dark, the certainty. She left the lens shard in the ash of a fire she'd built for warmth, half smashed so it could not be used but still identifiable, and she left it facing north, which was the direction she had gone. She told me later she had not thought consciously about whether I would come, only that if I did, she wanted to make the trail readable. She did not know about the bond. She had no reason to think I would tear myself from the capital and ride into the Greenwold in a storm on the instinct of an animal in my chest. She left the sign because she was the kind of person who left signs, thorough and precise, and she hoped it would be enough. My wolf set his direction at the ash of that fire. I stood in the ruined camp with the lens shard in my palm. It had caught the low winter light and thrown it, just briefly, across Bryn's face, and he had seen what it was and gone very still, and I felt something pull in my chest that I had not felt in 14 years of kingship. Not grief, not rage, something older, a direction, a wrongness in the air that had a name I couldn't quite read yet, like a word on a page in a language you know but have not spoken in years. She's ahead, my wolf said, not in words but in the way he leaned into my ribs, north-facing, patient. He had been saying it for 2 days. I had been listening. Now I stopped questioning and simply followed. The storm will close the Greenwold Trail, Bryn said. I know. If she's on it. She is. I didn't know how I knew. I knew. Take 4 riders and hold the western road exit. She's looping through the far ridge. She'll come out 2 days ahead if the storm doesn't catch her. Bryn looked at me with the particular expression he reserved for moments when he believed I was making a decision beyond what the evidence supported, and he was usually right to look at me that way, and I was going to be wrong half the time I ignored it. And you? He asked. I'm going into the Greenwold. He was quiet for a moment. Into the storm. Yes. He accepted this the way he accepted all the unreasonable things I did in the field, which was by adjusting the logistics around them without comment. He pulled 2 riders from the group and sent them back to secure the tower. He took the remaining 4 toward the western road. He did not ask me what I thought I would find in the Greenwold, because by then, I think, he had some idea. The way my wolf was pressing into my chest, the way I had not slept in 2 days, the fact that I was riding into a Greenwold storm to find a border watch sentinel who had been at my pack's edge for 4 years, and whom I could not have described to you in any detail 3 days prior. He had seen me go without sleep before. He had not seen me go without reason before. I went in alone. The Greenwood in winter is the kind of place that sorts out what you are. The black pines are old growth, the canopy so dense that even in a storm the snow comes in sideways instead of down, driven by wind off the plateau. The trail is marked with iron rods set in the ground 30 years ago by my grandfather's border patrols, and in a heavy storm those rods disappear to ankle height, and you navigate by instinct and the angle of the wind. I have crossed the Greenwood twice in winter. Both times with a full patrol, in daylight, in storms that were light by comparison to what was building. She had crossed into it alone, at night, in the beginning of this storm, with no patrol and no shelter but what she could make. My wolf drove me forward at a pace that was not quite sustainable and slightly past what made sense. I let him. He had been right about the direction for 2 days, and I had learned, in the years since my wolf had come fully into himself, that when he became this certain, arguing was what cost you. I found her traces 4 miles into the trail. A fire, cold but more recently cold than mine, built in the shelter of a fallen pine with the kind of care that told me she had done this before. The pine boughs were laid for maximum wind block, the fire circle built to keep coals alive. She had known what she was doing. She had slept here briefly and gone on. My wolf pressed harder. 6 miles in, I found a second camp. She hadn't slept this time, had only stopped long enough to eat, I judged from the swept-away remnants in the snow. She was moving faster than anyone should in this cold, which told me she knew what was behind her, not just what was ahead. I pushed. The storm peaked around the 9th hour of riding, the wind reaching the kind of pitch where sound became texture and the iron rods disappeared entirely. I went by the feel of the ground under my horse's hooves and the direction in my chest and the simple refusal to stop, which had served me through 2 famines and 3 wars, and which I saw no reason to abandon now. She had left me another sign. Halfway along the Greenwood Ridge, where the trail curved south toward the far slope, she had bent 3 small pines at waist height, the trail-marking trick that the border patrols use, 3 bends together meaning here, continue, all is well. She could not have known I would read it. She had left it anyway. I rode faster. The storm shelter on the far ridge is old. My grandfather's patrols built it, and it has been maintained poorly and rebuilt twice. The walls are solid stone, but the roof was replaced with timber and sod 12 years ago, and every winter there's a question of whether the sod holds. She had found it in the dark, in the storm, by instinct or by the knowledge she'd accumulated in 4 years of watching this borderland, and she had reinforced the roof with pine boughs. I saw them lashed over the sod as I came up the slope, a darker line against the pale sky. She had shoveled the entrance clear. She had set a fire inside that was visible through the gap under the door as a thin orange line. I dismounted 20 feet back. My wolf went very quiet, not the quiet of warning, the quiet of something that has arrived, finally, at the place it has been moving toward for longer than it understood. I stood in the snow for a moment. The storm had dropped in the last hour to something bearable, and I could hear, inside the shelter, the sound of her moving, the scrape of a boot against stone, the low, careful sound of someone who was listening at the same time they were moving, who had noted my horse and was deciding. I went to the door and said, "It's Calder." The sound inside stopped. I waited. The wind moved in the pines. My wolf held very still, the way he held still when he was listening past what I could hear. The door opened. She looked exactly as I should have expected, given that she had crossed the Greenwood alone in a winter storm. Her coat was matted with ice at the collar, her boots were dark with wet at the toe, and her hair had come out of its binding and dried into something between a braid and a tangle against the side of her face. She was carrying, I noticed, the small folding knife she kept at her left hip, and it was not drawn, but her hand was at her side in the way that meant it could be. Her eyes were the color of winter water over gray stone. She looked at me the way she had at the autumn muster, briefly, steady, taking account, and then she looked past me at the empty slope. "Alone," she said. "Bryn is holding the western road exit. I came in from the trail." She processed this in the way she processed everything, quickly, without visible expression, and then stored it and moved on. "Come in, then," she said, as if the king of Voronmal arriving at her shelter in a Greenwood storm in the middle of the night was a logistical matter to be managed. "The fire is low, but it's enough." I followed her inside. The shelter was small, 2 people and a fire, the walls pressing close, the smell of pine smoke and the particular cold that stays inside stone even when a fire is burning. She had laid her pack out with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times. Food to one side, dry wood stacked near the hearth, the long glass lens, the broken piece, wrapped in a fold of oiled cloth at the near edge of the fire circle where she could see it and reach it quickly. She sat across the fire from me. She did not ask me how I had known to come north. She did not ask me how I had found her in the storm. She looked at the fire and then at me and she said, "The lens has his man's reflection in it. The 4th face from the left in the hollow below the 2nd ridgeline. I've written the identifications here." She held out a folded piece of cloth, inner lining from her coat, I realized, cut away, written on in charcoal. I watched them for 3 hours, I counted. 47 men on the approach road that night plus the signal column from the Heldrath side. I can put dates and positions on everything I saw in the weeks before if you give me something to write with. I took the cloth. I read it by firelight. It was precise, thorough, and entirely damning. Positions, numbers, the timing of the signal fire, the movements of Casavith's men in the weeks prior that she had logged, and that I could now read in context. She had been watching for a month. She had noted every anomaly and not known what it meant until the night it all converged. "You didn't send a message, Bird," I said. 2 were already gone from the loft. I assumed the others would be watched. A pause. I was correct. Bryn's riders would have found the bodies of the remaining birds when they secured the tower. I set the cloth down carefully on my knee. The fire shifted. Outside, the storm pressed against the stone. "You crossed the Greenwold alone," I said. "Yes. In this." She looked at me with the Winterwater eyes. The Western Road was the only uncompromised route. The Greenwold Trail was the only access to the Western Road. She said this as if it were arithmetic. I was the only one in a position to make the crossing, so I made it. There was a silence. My wolf, very quiet in my chest, pressed forward, not urgently, not with the restless pull of the last 2 days. Simply forward, present, the way he leaned into things he recognized. "You should have let me know you were going," I said. "Left a sign at the tower." She looked at me, and for the first time something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "I left a sign at the fire camp," she said, "and on the ridge bend and in the shelter ash. I found them. I know," she looked back at the fire, "or you wouldn't be here. I cannot tell you exactly when the bond declared itself. I have thought about it since, tried to fix a moment, and the honest answer is that it had been arriving for 2 days. From the moment I had stood at her fire camp with the lens shard in my palm and felt the pull in my chest, through every mile of the Greenwold, through the moment she opened the shelter door and looked past me for threats before she looked at me. It had been building the way a winter storm builds, not a single moment of ignition, but a sustained accumulation that hits a threshold, and suddenly the air is different. The threshold, I think, was the cloth. Reading her handwriting by firelight, the precise dates, the careful identifications, the month of quiet watching, the note in the margin that said the 2nd Heldrath signal is new behavior, not consistent with trading routes, see previous 3 reports. Something in me understood all at once what kind of person sat across this fire. Not just capable, not just brave. The kind of steady, thorough, unseen courage that does not announce itself, and does not wait to be recognized, and does not ask. She had carried his treachery through a Greenwold storm, so that I would have proof. She had not done it because she expected reward. She had done it because it needed to be done, and she was the one who could do it. My wolf went utterly still, and then, very slowly, lowered his head. Not a posture I had ever felt him take. He was not a wolf who deferred. He lowered his head in the way of a wolf that has recognized something it has no defense against, not a threat, but something the opposite of a threat. Something that matched him in some deep way he had not expected and did not know how to name, and so he went quiet and let it settle into him. I looked across the fire at Saren. She was watching the fire. Her hands were wrapped around a small clay cup she had heated at the edge of the coals, and her face was the face of a woman who was managing exhaustion with the same efficiency she managed everything, not hiding it exactly, but setting it aside until it was convenient to be tired. There was frost still at her collar. There was charcoal on the inside of her right wrist from where she had cut the lining and written the report by feel in the dark. I said her name. She looked up, and I knew she felt it too, not because she startled or because she spoke, but because of the stillness that came over her, the same stillness my wolf had settled into. A recognition that arrived without warning and without any particular drama and was entirely undeniable. Her eyes met mine across the fire, and the bond was simply there, as if it had been there for 4 years, and only now had anyone looked directly at it. She looked at me for a long time. Then she looked back at the fire. "You didn't know," she said. It was not quite a question. "No," to pause, "you." A very small silence. "No," she said then, or I might have left a clearer sign at the fire camp. We stayed in the shelter until the storm broke, which was 6 hours later. Not because we had any particular reason to stay, but because going out into a Greenwood storm without cause is the kind of thing that only the reckless do, and neither of us was reckless. We talked through the Casavith problem in the way that two people who are both used to solving things talk through a problem. Not in circles, not with comfort words, but in logistics and implications and the specific question of what could be proven, and what would require testimony, and how quickly we could move before Casavith understood that his plan had failed. She was a better strategist than most of my counsel. I found this unsurprising. I found most things about her unsurprising in the way of the bond, as if I had known the shape of her before I knew the details, and the details were simply confirming what was already true. The thoroughness, the efficiency, the way she held still when she was thinking and moved quickly when she had decided. The way she looked at me when I said something she disagreed with, not challenging, not deferential, simply the look of a person evaluating a position for its merits. She disagreed with 2 of my initial assessments on the Casavith timeline and was correct both times. When the storm broke, we went out into the blue cold morning and I sent a signal, the long-distance fire method the border patrols had used since my grandfather's time, to Bryn on the Western Road, and then we rode. What happened at the Capitol I will tell briefly, because it is not the center of this story, it is the consequence. Bryn had been efficient in the 2 days since I had left him. He had quietly confirmed, through the Capitol's own intelligence, that Casavith's men were in position. He had sent word to 3 loyal lords in the eastern reaches. He had prepared the ground. All he needed was the proof, which arrived in the form of Saren of the outer settlements, her oiled-cloth report, and a broken lens. Casavith was summoned to the capital within a day of our return. He arrived with the particular confidence of a man who believes his exposure is impossible, and it was instructive to watch the confidence leave him, not quickly but in layers, as the evidence was presented, as face after face on the lens was identified by witnesses who had no connection to each other and no reason to lie. The 2 outer clans, when their role was confirmed, sent representatives to negotiate terms rather than face the consequences of open treachery. Casavith's 3 senior men turned, in the way that men turn when they understand the option is loyalty to a sinking lord or survival. It was thorough. It was, in the specific way that Saren would have described it, efficient. At the end of the council session, Osric, my lean, efficient administrator, said something to me as the room cleared that I have not forgotten. He said, "The Sentinel, Saren of the border post, how long has she been watching?" 4 years, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Her reports have been the most accurate border intelligence I've processed in 5 years. I sent a commendation 2 winters ago." He paused. "I assumed you had read it." I had not read it. That was my failure, not his, and I told him so. I went to find her that evening. She was in the provisioning courtyard, not because she had been summoned, but because the provisioning courtyard was where the border sentinels went when they were waiting for their assignment orders, and she was waiting for her assignment orders, because no one had told her she had any other options. She was sitting on the stone bench at the courtyard's far wall, the one the sentinels always claimed when they wanted to be out of the main corridor's traffic, with a report in her hands that she was reading through with the same careful attention she gave everything. She looked up when she heard my boots on the stone. "I've been waiting for the assignment order," she said. "Osric said the Grenhull post would need a replacement for the winter." "The Grenhull post," I said, "is going to need a permanent reassignment because you are not going back to it." She looked at me with the Winterwater eyes, evaluating. "I was good at it," she said. "I know." I came to stand in front of her, and she folded the report and held it in both hands and waited. "You were good at everything you did while we weren't paying attention. That ends now. A silence. The courtyard was empty, the last of the evening light cutting long and gold across the stone. "I want to show you something," I said. I held out my hand. On the inside of my left wrist, where the mate bond mark had been building since the shelter fire, a line of silver-pale light ran along the old scar from a border skirmish 12 years past, not replacing the scar, but following it, as if the bond had found the existing line and claimed it. My wolf had done this, I thought. Found the place that had already been marked and said here, and no other place. She looked at it for a long moment, then she turned her own wrist. The mark was there on her too, further down than mine, at the inner wrist where the pulse is, a small, precise line of the same silver pale. She had noticed it that morning, she told me later. She had assumed it was an artifact of the cold. She met my eyes. "I'm a border watcher," she said. "I have no title and no house, and I spent 4 years being the person who waited at the end of the queue." "You spent 4 years being the only person who noticed everything that mattered," I said. "That has a title in Voronmal, it's Luna." Her lips pressed together, not rejecting it, processing it. She was always processing. "The pack won't," she began. "The pack," I said, "saw you walk out of the Greenwood with the proof that saved this kingdom. What the pack thinks at this moment is not a problem I have." I paused. "Come and see." The great hall of Voronmal's capital holds 500 people when packed, and that evening it held very nearly that. Word had moved, as word moves in a pack, fast, laterally, through every corridor and courtyard. And what had moved was not merely the news of Kassavith's treachery, but the nature of the sentinel who had carried the proof of it. By the time I brought Saren through the hall, every senior pack member who had been at the capital in the past 24 hours had found reason to be present. I had not arranged this. I recognized it for what it was, the pack's instinct, older than politics, older than my 14 years of kingship. They had felt the bond before either of us had named it, in the way that packs feel these things, not through speech or argument, but through the change in the air, the direction the alpha's wolf faces, the particular quality of attention. Saren walked beside me and did not look at the crowd. She looked at the floor in the way she looked at things when she was storing them, not submission, just absorption. She was, I thought, making a record. She would have an accurate count of the number of people in the hall before we reached the far end. The pack fell quiet as we walked. Not dramatically, not in a performed wave of silence, but the conversations dropped out, one by one, the way fires go out when the wind takes them, until by the time we reached the stone dais at the hall's end, there was no sound in the room but the fire in the great hearth and the settling of coats. I turned, she stood beside me. I did not make a speech. I am not a king who makes speeches when a fact will do. I raised her hand, the hand with the bond mark, and held it where the firelight would catch the silver-pale line on her wrist, and I said in the voice I use when I want 500 people to hear me without effort. "Saren of Voronmal's northern border, 4 years at the Grenhill post, the woman who crossed the Greenwood alone in a storm to put this pack's enemies in my hand." A pause. "My mate, your Luna." The silence held for a breath. My wolf in my chest stood at full height. Then someone in the crowd, I could not see who, and I have never found out though I have asked, bent their knee. And the sound of it, the particular sound of a single person kneeling on stone, carried in the way sounds carry in a held silence. And then it happened again, and again, and then the whole room was moving, not in unison, but in the ragged, honest way of people responding to something real, and the hall went down. Saren looked at it. She stood very still, the way she went still when she was taking account. Then she looked at me. "I'm going to need better boots," she said quietly, "if I'm staying." I kept my face straight. "That can be arranged. And I want to see the border reports. All of them, not just the Grenhill corridor." "Granted. And, Saren..." She stopped. "You can have whatever you need," I said. "You have always been able to have whatever you needed. You just had to wait at the end of the queue for too long, and that is my failure, not yours, and it is finished." She looked at me for a long moment. The hall was still kneeling. The fire cracked in the hearth. Outside, the Greenwood wind moved through the black pines the way it moved through them every night, indifferent and endless. Then she nodded, once, in the small, efficient way she had of registering a thing that had been settled. "That was 3 years ago. I am telling it now because someone asked me, recently, a young lord of the eastern reaches. newly bonded himself and struggling to understand what the bond is, whether it is something that arrives fully formed or something that reveals itself in the doing. And I said, "It depends on whether you are paying attention." For 14 years I had not paid the right kind of attention. I had paid attention to the things that announced themselves, the ambitious lords, the loud succession claims, the crises that came with banners. I had not paid attention to the border watcher who waited at the end of the queue and did everything right and sent reports that were, Osric told me later, the most accurate intelligence he had processed in 5 years. My wolf had been paying attention. He had been paying attention. It emerged since the autumn muster 3 years before she vanished, since the moment she had met my eyes in the sentinel line without flinching and without performing, and he had leaned forward in my chest and I had walked on. He is a patient wolf. He waited until I could not ignore it anymore. He drove me into a Greenwood storm in the middle of winter, which I think was excessive, but I acknowledge that if he had not, I might have waited longer still. Saren runs the border intelligence now, the full northern corridor, not just the Grenhall post. She has restructured the sentinel rotation, replaced 3 positions, and caught 2 additional incursions in the past 18 months. The Cassavith Eastern Reaches are administered now by one of the lords Bryn had quietly aligned before my return. A steady, pragmatic man who sends accurate reports and does not make promises he cannot keep, which are, Saren informed me, the 2 qualities she considers sufficient. She has not thrown away the broken lens shard from the fire camp. It sits on the window ledge of our chamber, the north-facing window, the one that looks toward the Greenwood. I asked her once why she kept it. She thought about it for a moment in the way she thinks about things. Then, "It's a sign," she said. "The one I left when I wasn't sure you were coming." She turned it in her fingers. "I like having it where I can see it." And now, she looked at me with the Winterwater eyes, a fraction of the not quite amusement at the corner of her mouth. "Now," she said, "I know you come." The bond mark on my wrist caught the morning light and held it. In my chest, my wolf lay down in the particular settled way of a wolf that is, finally and completely, home. Outside, the Greenwood moved in the cold. Inside, she set the lens on the sill and turned back to the reports, and I watched her work, and that was enough. That has always been enough. A border watcher who saw everything the pack looked past, who crossed a frozen wilderness alone to protect a king she did not yet know was hers, who left signs in the dark in case I was coming. I will spend the rest of my kingship being worthy of the sign she left.